My name is Ida Wilson. I am 62 years old. After a 3-month dream trip through Europe, I came home to find my key wouldn't work in the front door of the house I'd owned for 35 years. When a strange woman answered, she introduced herself as my late husband Howard's second wife. My own children had signed over my house to her while I was gone. I later discovered she wasn't Howard's wife at all, but his secretary who had manipulated my vulnerable children after his death. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife ever could. Before I tell you how I fought to reclaim what was rightfully mine, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and please hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand up against your own family for what's right. The morning sunlight used to stream through the kitchen windows of my colonial-style home in the suburbs of Boston, creating patterns on the hardwood floors Howard had installed himself back in 1992. Every inch of that house held memories. 3 decades of birthday parties, holiday gatherings, and quiet Sunday mornings reading the paper with Howard over coffee. We bought the house in 1985 when Thomas was just 5. Linda was 3, and I was pregnant with Kevin. It was far beyond what we could afford at the time. Howard had just started his own law practice, and I was teaching high school English. We stretched every dollar sometimes, eating macaroni and cheese for a week straight to make the mortgage payment. "This house is an investment in our future," Howard would say whenever I worried about the bills. "Someday we'll own it outright, and it will be our legacy to the children." After 30 years of payments, we finally paid off the mortgage on our 30th anniversary. Howard had framed the deed, displaying it proudly in his home office. "Property of Howard and Ida Wilson," it declared in official black ink. Our names joined together on this piece of paper, just as we had joined our lives together all those years ago. Howard was always the practical one, the planner. A brilliant lawyer with a reputation for meticulous attention to detail, he built his practice from nothing into one of the most respected firms in Boston. While he wasn't one for grand romantic gestures, his love showed in the careful way he provided for us, ensuring we would always be secure. When he died of a sudden stroke 2 years ago at 65, I found myself adrift in a sea of grief and paperwork. Howard had handled all our finances, our insurance, our investments. I had to learn it all while still processing the reality that my partner of 40 years was gone forever. "Dad always said you weren't good with money," Thomas told me shortly after the funeral offering to take over the financial aspects of Howard's estate. "He worried about you being on your own." That comment stung, though I wasn't entirely sure it was true. Howard had certainly been the financial manager in our marriage, but he had never expressed concerns about my abilities. Still, grief can distort memories, and I wanted to believe my son was only trying to help. Thomas, our eldest at 40, had followed his father into the business world, though not law. He ran a commercial real estate company, married with 2 teenage daughters. He had always been Howard's shadow, eager to prove himself worthy of his father's respect. Howard had been particularly hard on Thomas, pushing him to excel, to stand on his own 2 feet financially. "Never expect handouts," Howard would tell all our children. "Everything I've built, I've earned through hard work. I expect you to do the same." Linda, our middle child at 38, had perhaps exceeded Howard's expectations by becoming a successful orthopedic surgeon. She had always been the most academically gifted of our children, determined to prove herself in a male-dominated field. She married another doctor, had 1 son, and maintained a careful distance from family drama. Howard had been immensely proud of her accomplishments, but sometimes struggled to express it. Kevin, our youngest, at 35, was the free spirit, an aspiring musician who worked part-time at a recording studio while trying to launch his own band. Howard had been frustrated by Kevin's lack of practical ambition, as he called it. Their relationship had been strained during Howard's final years, with frequent arguments about Kevin's financial dependence. "You need to grow up and take responsibility," Howard had told him during one particularly heated Christmas dinner. "I didn't work my entire life so you could waste yours chasing pipe dreams." I had always been the mediator, the bridge between Howard's pragmatism and our children's individual paths. Perhaps that's why none of them were particularly close to their father, though they respected him. Howard provided stability and security, but emotional connection had always been my department. Then there was Amanda Phillips. Amanda came into Howard's life 10 years before his death, hired as his legal secretary, when his practice had grown too large for him to manage alone. She was 25 then, fresh out of paralegal school, with sleek brown hair, impeccable clothes, and an efficiency that Howard immediately valued. "She's a godsend," Howard had told me after her first month. "Organized, intelligent, anticipates what I need before I even ask. Best hire I've ever made." I remember meeting her at the firm's holiday party that year. She was pretty in a calculated way, with perfect makeup and a tailored black dress that hugged her curves without being inappropriate for a work function. She shook my hand firmly, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Mrs. Wilson, I've heard so much about you," she said, her voice warm but somehow hollow. "Howard speaks of you constantly." Something about her made me uneasy from that first meeting. The way her eyes lingered on Howard, a beat too long. The casual use of his first name when other staff still called him Mr. Wilson. The subtle way she positioned herself between us during conversations. "You're being ridiculous," Howard said, when I mentioned my discomfort on the drive home. "Amanda is a professional. She's helping me build the business. That benefits all of us." Over the years, Amanda became increasingly integrated into Howard's professional life. She attended client meetings, helped prepare cases, even accompanied him to legal conferences. Howard insisted it was all business necessary for the growth of his practice. And I trusted my husband, even as I continued to feel a vague disquiet about Amanda's presence in his life. After Howard died, Amanda attended the funeral, sitting primly in the third row, dabbing at dry eyes with a pristine handkerchief. She approached me afterward, offering condolences that sounded rehearsed. "Howard was a wonderful man, and an exceptional mentor," she said, her hand briefly touching my arm. "If there's anything I can do to help with his affairs, please don't hesitate to ask." I thanked her politely, but had no intention of involving her. Howard's practice was being dissolved, his clients distributed among his partners. Amanda, I assumed, would find another job and disappear from our lives. How wrong I was. In the months following Howard's death, I slowly rebuilt my life. I joined a grief support group, reconnected with old friends, started volunteering at the local library. The house felt too big and empty without Howard, but I couldn't bear the thought of leaving it. Every corner held memories of our life together, of raising our children, of building our dreams. When Margaret, my best friend since college, suggested I take the trip to Europe that Howard and I had always planned but never managed, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to heal. "You've spent your whole life taking care of others," Margaret said over lunch one day. "Howard, the children, your students. It's time you did something just for yourself." The idea took root. 3 months exploring the places Howard and I had always talked about visiting: Paris, Rome, the Greek islands, Vienna. I could almost hear Howard's practical voice in my head, calculating costs, planning itineraries. I called a family dinner to discuss the plan. Thomas, Linda, and Kevin all came, though it was the first time we'd all been together since the funeral. "I think it's a great idea, Mum," Linda said, surprising me with her enthusiasm. "You deserve it after everything you've been through." "Who's going to watch the house?" Thomas asked, always practical like his father. "You can't leave it empty for 3 months." "I could stay there," Kevin suggested. "Save some rent money while you're gone." Thomas scoffed. "And throw parties every weekend." "No way. I'll stop by regularly to check on things." In the end, I gave Thomas a key and asked him to collect my mail and ensure everything was in order. I set up automatic payments for the utilities, packed my bags, and boarded a plane to Paris, with a lightness I hadn't felt since before Howard's death. For 3 glorious months, I explored Europe, sending postcards to my children from each destination. I sat at cafes in Paris, visited museums in Florence, watched sunsets over the Mediterranean, and felt Howard's presence beside me in each new discovery. "You would have loved this," I whispered to him as I stood in the Sistine Chapel, gazing up at Michelangelo's masterpiece. We should have done this years ago. By the time I boarded my flight back to Boston, I felt renewed, ready to embrace life again. The grief was still there, but it had softened into something I could carry without being crushed by its weight. How could I have known that the real ordeal was just beginning? That while I was rediscovering myself among the ancient streets of Europe, the foundation of my life back home was being systematically dismantled by the very people I trusted most. The taxi dropped me off in front of the familiar two-story colonial I'd called home for 35 years. I breathed in the crisp October air, admiring the maple trees in our front yard, now ablaze with autumn colours. It felt good to be home, despite the bittersweet memories the house held. Something felt different, though. The gardens I'd lovingly tended for decades looked changed. My hydrangea bushes had been removed, replaced with ornamental grasses I would never have chosen. The rocking chair that had sat on the front porch since Thomas was a baby was gone. Probably just Thomas trying to help, I murmured to myself, wheeling my suitcase up the front walk. I inserted my key into the front door lock, but it wouldn't turn. Frowning, I tried again, jiggling it slightly as the old lock sometimes required. Still nothing. "That's strange," I said aloud, setting down my luggage to inspect the lock more carefully. That's when I noticed it was a completely different lock than the one I'd left 3 months ago. My heart began to race. Had there been a break-in? Had Thomas changed the locks for security reasons while I was gone? I rang the doorbell, hoping Thomas might be inside, checking on things as promised. After a moment, the door swung open, but it wasn't my son who greeted me. A woman stood in the doorway of my home. She was in her mid-30s, slender, with sleek brown hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She wore designer jeans and a cashmere sweater I immediately recognized as one that would have been well beyond my teacher's budget. "Amanda," I said, recognizing Howard's former secretary with a jolt of confusion. She looked genuinely startled to see me, her perfectly shaped eyebrows rising in surprise. "Ida, you're back from Europe already." Already, I'd been gone exactly as long as planned, 3 months to the day. "What are you doing in my house?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "And why has the lock been changed?" Amanda's expression shifted from surprise to something more guarded. She straightened her posture, crossing her arms defensively. "I think there's been some miscommunication," she said, her tone carefully measured. "This is my house now. Your children didn't tell you." A cold wave of disbelief washed over me. "What are you talking about? This is my home. Howard and I paid off this mortgage years ago." Amanda's smile was tight, practiced. "Perhaps you should call your children. There's been a change in the ownership situation while you were away." "I don't need to call anyone," I said firmly, trying to step past her into my own home. "This is my house. I don't know what game you're playing, but I want you to leave immediately." Amanda blocked my path, her slender frame suddenly as immovable as a stone wall. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Ida. Legally, this house belongs to me now." "That's impossible," I said, my voice rising with panic and anger. "Howard left everything to me. The house is in my name." "Not anymore," Amanda replied, reaching into a sleek leather purse hanging by my door, and producing a folded document. "The house was transferred to me last month. Your children signed the papers. It's all perfectly legal." I snatched the document from her hands, unfolding it with trembling fingers. There it was, in black and white, a deed transfer, my name replaced with Amanda Phillips, and at the bottom the signatures of my 3 children, Thomas, Linda, and Kevin. "This can't be real," I whispered, the world spinning around me. "Why would my children give you my house?" Amanda's expression softened into something that might have been pity, but felt more like condescension. "Because Howard wanted me to have it. I was his wife, Ida, his second wife." The words hit me like a physical blow. "That's a lie," I said, my voice barely audible. "Howard and I were married for 40 years. He never divorced me. He never remarried." "We were married in private," Amanda said smoothly. Howard didn't want to hurt you, so we kept it quiet. But he wanted me to have the house after he was gone. Your children were just respecting his wishes. I felt as though I might collapse right there on my own front porch. This was absurd, impossible. Howard would never have betrayed me like this. And my children. They would never have given away my home, especially not to this woman. With shaking hands, I pulled my phone from my purse and called Thomas. It rang 4 times before he answered. "Mum." He sounded wary, as if he'd been expecting my call. "You're back." "Thomas, there is a woman in our house claiming that you and your siblings signed it over to her, that she was your father's second wife. This has to be some kind of mistake." There was a long pause. Too long. "It's not a mistake," Thomas finally said, his voice flat. "Amanda showed us Dad's handwritten will. He wanted her to have the house." "What are you talking about?" I cried. "Your father had a legal will, with a lawyer. Everything came to me." "This was different, Mum. It was his real wishes, what he couldn't say publicly. Amanda was special to him. He would have wanted us to do this." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Thomas, this woman is lying to you. Your father loved me. We were married for 40 years. "Mom, don't make a scene," Thomas said sharply. "This is embarrassing enough without you causing a public spectacle. We can talk about this later." "A spectacle," I repeated incredulously. "Thomas, I've just returned from a trip to find I've been locked out of my own home, the home your father and I built together." "It's done, Mum," he said with finality. "The papers are signed. The house belongs to Amanda now. We'll find you somewhere else to live." Before I could respond, he hung up. I stood there, phone in hand, staring at Amanda, who watched me with a calm, almost triumphant expression. With trembling fingers, I called Linda next. My daughter, always practical and level-headed, would surely see reason. "Mum," she answered, her voice clinical and detached. "I thought you might call." "Linda, please tell me you didn't sign away my house to your father's secretary." "Former secretary," Linda corrected automatically. "And Dad's wife, Mum. This was his wish. We're just carrying it out." "Your father was not married to Amanda," I insisted. "I would have known. We were together every day." "Not every day," Linda said coldly. "You were often busy with your book clubs and volunteer work. Dad was lonely. Amanda was there for him when you weren't." The accusation stung like a slap. I had always been devoted to Howard. Yes, I had my own interests and activities, but that was healthy in a marriage. Howard had encouraged my independence. "Linda, this is insane. Where am I supposed to live? Everything I own is in that house." "We'll help you find a nice condo or apartment," Linda replied, as if we were discussing a minor inconvenience rather than the theft of my home. "It's for the best, Mum. The house is too big for you anyway." I tried Kevin next, my youngest, always the most sensitive of my children. Surely he would understand the magnitude of this betrayal. "Kevin, please," I begged when he answered. "Tell me what's going on. Why did you sign away my house?" There was a pause, and I could hear him sigh heavily. "Mum, I'm sorry. I didn't want to, but Thomas and Linda convinced me it was what Dad wanted. And Amanda had all this proof." "What proof, Kevin?" "There is no proof. Your father and I were happily married until the day he died." "I don't know, Mum," Kevin said, his voice uncertain. "She had letters, photos, and she gave us money, said it was from Dad." "She bribed you," I gasped. "Not bribed." Kevin backpedaled quickly. "It was our inheritance from Dad. Through her. Look, I can't talk about this right now. I have a gig. We'll figure something out, okay?" And then he too was gone, leaving me standing on my own porch, locked out of my home with a stranger claiming to be my husband's secret wife, watching me with calculated patience. Your things are in storage, Amanda said almost kindly. I've paid for 3 months. Your children have the access information. I stared at her, this woman who had somehow manipulated my family into betraying me. This isn't over, I said, finding strength in my growing anger. Howard would never have done this to me, and deep down my children know that. Amanda's expression hardened slightly. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be, Ida. You had your time with Howard. He moved on. Accept it, and move on yourself. With that, she closed the door. My door in my face, leaving me alone on the porch with my suitcase and the crushing weight of betrayal. I stood there for several minutes, unable to process what had just happened. Then, on autopilot, I wheeled my suitcase back down the front walk and called the only person I knew would help me without question. Margaret, it's Ida. Something terrible has happened. Can you come get me? 20 minutes later, Margaret pulled up in her sensible Volvo. One look at my face told her everything she needed to know. Get in, she said firmly. Whatever it is, we'll fix it. As we drove away from the house I'd called home for 35 years, I couldn't stop the tears that finally came hot and bitter down my cheeks. They took my house, Margaret, I sobbed. My own children gave away my house to Howard's secretary, who's claiming she was secretly married to him. The world has gone completely insane. Margaret reached over and squeezed my hand. Then we'll bring it back to sanity one step at a time. First, you're staying with me. Second, we're calling a lawyer. And third, her voice hardened with determination, we're going to find out exactly what this Amanda person is really up to. In that moment, I was profoundly grateful for true friendship, the kind that stands firm when family inexplicably crumbles. I had no idea what lay ahead, but I knew with absolute certainty that I would not surrender my home or my dignity without a fight. The next morning, sitting in Margaret's sunny kitchen with a cup of strong coffee, I tried to make sense of the incomprehensible situation. How could my children believe Howard had secretly married his secretary? How could they give away my home without even consulting me? We need to understand what we're dealing with, Margaret said pragmatically. She had always been the analytical one in our friendship, while I tended to lead with my heart. This Amanda woman has obviously been planning this for some time. But why? I asked, staring into my coffee cup as if it might hold answers. Why my house specifically? And how did she convince my children to go along with it? Margaret tapped her fingers thoughtfully on the table. Money is usually the simplest explanation. Your house must be worth what now? In this market, I calculated quickly, probably close to 2 million. We bought it for just under 200,000 back in '85. There's your motive, Margaret said grimly. As for your children, well, you mentioned Kevin said something about Amanda giving them money. I nodded, the betrayal still a fresh wound. He said it wasn't a bribe, that it was their inheritance from Howard through her, whatever that means. It means she bought them, Margaret stated flatly. The question is, where did she get that kind of money? Was she actually in Howard's will at all? Absolutely not, I said firmly. I saw the will after he died. Everything came to me with provisions for the children after I'm gone. Howard's partner handled it all. Margaret grabbed a notepad and began making a list. Okay, so we need to look at several angles. First, we need a good lawyer. Second, we need to investigate Amanda's background and her relationship with Howard. And third, we need to understand exactly how she manipulated your children. I can't believe they would betray me like this, I said, my voice breaking. After everything Howard and I did for them, Margaret reached across the table and squeezed my hand. People make terrible decisions when money is involved, Ida. Even good people. Even family. By noon, we had a plan. Margaret called her nephew, a private investigator named Stephen, asking him to look into Amanda's background. I called Richard Coleman, Howard's oldest friend and law partner, who had handled our legal affairs for decades. Richard was shocked when I explained the situation. That's preposterous, he sputtered over the phone. Howard was devoted to you, Ida, and he certainly wasn't secretly married to his secretary. I would have known. My children seem convinced otherwise, I said bitterly. I'll meet you this afternoon, Richard promised. We'll get to the bottom of this. While waiting for Richard, Margaret and I began our own investigation. We started with social media, finding Amanda's carefully curated Instagram page, filled with photos of expensive restaurants, designer clothes, and exotic vacations. How could a legal secretary afford such a lifestyle? More disturbing were recent photos of her standing in my kitchen, my living room, my garden, with captions like "Home Sweet Home" and "New Beginnings." She's been planning this for months, Margaret muttered, scrolling through the timeline. Look, she posted this right after Howard died. The photo showed Amanda looking somber in a black dress with the caption, "Saying goodbye to a special man who changed my life forever. Our secret dies with you, but our love lives on." That manipulative little... Margaret caught herself. Sorry, but she's clearly been laying groundwork for this secret relationship narrative for a long time. Richard arrived at Margaret's house precisely at 3, his silver hair impeccable, his suit as crisp and professional as always. Though in his late 60s, he carried himself with the energy of a much younger man. "Ida," he greeted me with a warm hug. "I'm so sorry about this mess. I've already pulled Howard's will and all associated documents from our files. There is absolutely nothing in there about Amanda Phillips." We sat in Margaret's living room, spreading papers across her coffee table. "Howard's will is crystal clear," Richard explained, pointing to the relevant sections. "The house and all assets pass to you, Ida. Upon your death, they're to be divided equally among your children. There are no codicils, no amendments, nothing that even mentions Amanda Phillips." "Then how could she possibly claim ownership of my house?" I asked. Richard's expression darkened. "From what you've told me, it sounds like she convinced your children to transfer the deed after Howard's death. If you gave Thomas power of attorney while you were traveling..." "I did. I admitted remembering the paperwork I'd signed before my trip, just to handle any emergencies with the house while I was gone. That would give him the legal authority to transfer the property, especially if Linda and Kevin agreed as potential inheritors," Richard explained. "It's unethical and morally reprehensible, but potentially legal if the paperwork was handled correctly." "So I've lost my home?" I asked, my voice small. "Not necessarily," Richard said firmly. "There are several angles we can pursue. First, we can challenge the transfer on the grounds that it violated the intent of the power of attorney. Second, we can investigate Amanda's claims about being married to Howard, which I can tell you right now are completely false. And third," he leaned forward intently, "we need to understand why your children would do this." Margaret's phone rang, interrupting our discussion. "It's Stephen," she said, putting the call on speaker. "I've got some preliminary information on Amanda Phillips." Stephen's professional voice came through the speaker. "And it's interesting. She's worked at 5 different law firms in the past 15 years, always as a secretary or paralegal to senior male partners. In each case, she stayed for 2-3 years, then moved on." "That fits the timeline," I said. "She was with Howard for about 10 years before he died." "That's the longest she's stayed anywhere," Stephen noted. "I'm still digging, but there are some rumors from her previous employers. Nothing concrete enough for me to share yet, but let's just say there's a pattern of getting unusually close to the attorneys she worked for." "Keep digging," Margaret instructed, "especially anything about her financial situation." After Stephen hung up, Richard turned to me with determination in his eyes. "Ida, I think it's time we spoke directly with your children one by one, starting with Thomas, since he would have been the one to actually execute the transfer." I nodded, steeling myself for what promised to be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. Thomas agreed to meet us at his office downtown rather than at his home. "I don't want to upset Diane and the girls with this," he explained over the phone, referring to his wife and daughters. His office was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor. Thomas had done well for himself in commercial real estate, at least on the surface. He rose from behind his desk when we entered, looking uncomfortable but defiant. "Mom, Richard," he greeted us stiffly. "I assume this is about the house." "You assume correctly," Richard replied, his tone professionally neutral. I'd like to understand how Howard's secretary came to own Ida's home. Thomas shifted in his expensive leather chair. Amanda wasn't just Dad's secretary. They had a relationship. She showed us proof. What kind of proof? I asked, trying to keep the hurt from my voice. Thomas opened a drawer and withdrew a manila envelope. Letters, photos, a handwritten will Dad left with her. I took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were several photographs of Howard and Amanda together at what appeared to be work functions. Nothing romantic, nothing that wouldn't be expected of a lawyer and his secretary. The letters were emails printed out discussing cases, schedules, normal work correspondence. The so-called will was a single sheet of paper with a brief note. In the event of my death, I want Amanda to have the house. She knows why. Please honor this request. Howard Wilson. This is ridiculous, I said, looking up at my son. This isn't a will. It's not even notarized. And the handwriting is questionable at best. Richard finished for me, examining the paper closely. This would never stand up in court, Thomas. Surely you know that. Thomas looked away, a flush creeping up his neck. Amanda said Dad wanted to keep their relationship private, to protect Mum's feelings. She said they were in love for years. And you believed that? I asked incredulously. Thomas, your father and I were married for 40 years. We were happy. He would never have betrayed me like this, and he certainly wouldn't have expected his children to give away my home. Thomas still wouldn't meet my eyes. Amanda was very convincing, and she offered us compensation. There it was. The truth, finally. How much? Richard asked bluntly. How much did she pay you to steal your mother's home? It wasn't like that, Thomas protested weakly. She gave us each a portion of what she said was Dad's private savings, money he had set aside for her that she wanted to share with us. And how much was your portion? I pressed. Thomas hesitated. 200,000. The amount hit me like a physical blow. My son had sold my home, my security, for $200,000. Thomas, I said quietly, that house is worth 10 times that amount. Even if you believed Amanda's story, which is completely false, you gave away millions of dollars of equity for a fraction of its value. Something shifted in Thomas's expression, then a flicker of doubt crossing his features. She said the house meant more to her sentimentally than financially, that she and Dad had planned to live there together after you. He trailed off. After what died was pushed aside. I felt anger rising in me, hot and clarifying. Your father would be ashamed of what you've done, Thomas. Not just the betrayal of me, but the poor business decision. You were scammed, plain and simple. Richard interjected, his voice calm but authoritative. Thomas, as someone who knew your father professionally and personally for 40 years, I can tell you with absolute certainty that he was not having an affair with Amanda Phillips. This will is a forgery, and her story is a fabrication designed to manipulate you and your siblings. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father that it made my heart ache despite my anger. Why would she go to all this trouble? Risk legal consequences? For a $2 million house that cost her only $600,000 to acquire, Richard replied dryly. I think the math speaks for itself. As we left Thomas's office, I could see the first cracks in his certainty, the first stirrings of doubt about what he and his siblings had done. It was a start, but we still had a long way to go. Linda was next. She agreed to meet us at a coffee shop near the hospital where she worked, squeezing us in during her lunch break. Always efficient, my daughter. I have 30 minutes, she said briskly, as we sat down, still wearing her doctor's coat, a stethoscope around her neck. Then I have patients waiting. This won't take long, Richard assured her. We just want to understand your perspective on the house situation. Linda's professional demeanor faltered slightly. Look, I know it seems harsh, Mom, but Dad made his wishes clear to Amanda. He wanted her to have the house. Linda, I said gently, your father and I built that life together. We raised you children there. Do you honestly believe he would want to take it away from me? You weren't always there for him, Mum, Linda said, a hint of accusation in her tone. Especially in those last few years. You had your friends, your book clubs, your volunteer work. Dad was lonely. The accusation stung. Your father encouraged my independence, I defended. We were partners who supported each other's interests and needs. That's what you thought, Linda replied. But Amanda told us how he would confide in her, how they grew closer over time. She showed us evidence. Richard slid the manila envelope across the table. Is this the same evidence she showed you? Photos of work events, professional emails, a supposed handwritten will that wouldn't hold up in any court in the country. Linda examined the contents, her clinical gaze assessing each item. I could see her doctor's mind working, evaluating, questioning. She also had other things, Linda said slowly. Private messages, details about our family she couldn't have known unless Dad told her. Like what? I challenged. Like how you and Dad almost divorced when Thomas was 12, Linda said. Amanda knew all about that rough patch. I felt the blood drain from my face. Howard and I had indeed gone through a difficult period when Thomas was young. Howard was building his practice, working long hours, and I felt neglected. We'd seen a marriage counselor, briefly worked through our issues, and emerged stronger. But it wasn't something we'd ever discussed with our children. How could she have known that? Linda pressed, seeing my reaction. Office gossip, Richard suggested. Or access to Howard's personal files. As his secretary, she would have had opportunities to learn private information. That doesn't prove a relationship, Linda. It proves she was invasive and inappropriate in her professional role. Linda frowned, doubt beginning to cloud her certainty. She gave me $50,000, she admitted. Said it was my share of a private account Dad had maintained for her. I used it to pay off my medical school loans. 50,000. My daughter had helped sell my home for $50,000. Linda, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. I understand the temptation, but I raised you to know right from wrong. Deep down, you must have questioned this arrangement. I did, she admitted reluctantly. But Thomas was so convinced. And Amanda had all these details, all this supposed evidence. It seemed plausible that Dad might have had a second life we didn't know about. A second life that conveniently only his secretary knew about, Richard asked pointedly. Not his law partner of 40 years, not any other friends or colleagues. I could see Linda's logical mind processing this inconsistency, her medical training in evaluating evidence coming to the fore. I might have made a mistake, she conceded finally. But the papers are signed. The deed transfer is complete. What can we do now? That, Richard said with grim determination, is what we're going to find out. Kevin proved the hardest to pin down. He didn't answer his phone, didn't respond to texts. Finally, I went directly to the small recording studio where he worked part-time, hoping to catch him between sessions. I found him in the break room, guitar in hand, working on what appeared to be a new song. He looked up when I entered, guilt immediately washing over his features. Mum, he said, setting the guitar aside. I guess we need to talk. Yes, we do, I agreed, sitting across from him. Richard had stayed behind, thinking Kevin might be more forthcoming with just me present. I'm sorry, Kevin blurted before I could say anything further. I never wanted to sign those papers. Thomas and Linda pressured me. They said it was what Dad wanted, and Amanda was so convincing, and I needed the money for the studio time and… Breathe, Kevin. I interrupted his rambling. How much did she give you? 30,000, he admitted, looking ashamed. It's gone already. Studio time equipment, promotional materials for the band's new album. And did you really believe your father was secretly involved with his secretary? I asked, trying to keep the hurt from my voice. That he would want to leave me homeless after 40 years of marriage. Kevin's eyes filled with tears. I didn't want to believe it. But Amanda knew things, Mum. Personal things. She showed us a key to the house, said Dad had given it to her years ago. She even knew about the loose floorboard in Dad's office where he kept his emergency cash. That detail hit me hard. The loose floorboard was indeed something only family would know about. Howard had kept a small stash of cash there, just in case, a habit from his own father's Depression-era mentality. Kevin, your father, wasn't having an affair with Amanda. She was his employee who clearly overstepped professional boundaries and took advantage of her position to learn personal details about our family. But the will was a forgery, I said firmly. Richard is certain of it, and he knew your father's handwriting better than anyone except me. Kevin looked stricken. What have we done, Mum? We gave away your house. Where are you even staying right now? With Margaret, I said. But that's temporary. I want my home back, Kevin. The home your father and I built together, the home we raised you in. I'll help, Kevin said immediately, his usual impulsiveness now working in my favor. Whatever it takes. I'll tell everyone Amanda manipulated us. I'll admit we were wrong. I reached across the table and took my youngest son's hand. Thank you, Kevin. That's a start. By the time I returned to Margaret's house, Stephen had more information for us. We gathered in her living room as he laid out his findings. Amanda Phillips isn't even her real name, Stephen revealed. She was born Amanda Watkins in a small town in Nevada. She has a history of getting close to older wealthy men in positions of authority. Before working for Howard, she was secretary to a senior partner at a firm in New York, who suddenly changed his will to include her, causing a family rift. Before that, she worked for a judge in Philadelphia, who gave her an expensive car as a bonus. She's a predator, Margaret said disgustedly. And there's more, Stephen continued. She has a sealed record in Nevada. I'm still working on accessing it, but from what I've gathered, it involved fraud of some kind when she was in her 20s. Richard nodded grimly. This is excellent work, Stephen. It gives us a strong foundation to challenge the deed transfer. What's our next step? I asked, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time since returning home. I think it's time we confronted Amanda directly, Richard said. With all three of your children present, let her try to maintain her story when faced with the truth and a united family. The stage was set for a showdown that would determine not just the fate of my home, but the future of my family itself. The next morning, Richard called a family meeting at his downtown law office. The formal setting was intentional neutral territory, with a professional atmosphere that would remind everyone of the serious legal implications at stake. I arrived early with Margaret, my stomach in knots. I hadn't slept well, plagued by dreams of Howard, of our home, of the life we'd built that was now under threat. It's going to be okay, Margaret reassured me, squeezing my hand as we sat in Richard's elegant conference room. The truth is on your side. Richard entered immaculate as always in a tailored suit, carrying a thick folder of documents. Stephen delivered these this morning, he said, placing the folder on the table. Amanda Phillips's complete background investigation. It's quite illuminating. My children arrived one by one. Thomas first looking uncomfortable in his business suit, avoiding my eyes as he took a seat across the table. Linda next, still in her hospital scrubs, clearly having come directly from her shift. Kevin slipped in last, giving me a small apologetic smile as he sat beside me, rather than with his siblings, a gesture of allegiance that brought tears to my eyes. Thank you all for coming, Richard began formally. We're here to discuss a very serious situation involving the Wilson family home and Amanda Phillips. Ida has asked me to moderate this discussion as someone who knew Howard well, both personally and professionally. Thomas cleared his throat. Is Amanda joining us? She'll be here shortly, Richard confirmed. I wanted to speak with the family first. He turned to face my children directly. Before Amanda arrives, I want to be very clear about something. Howard Wilson was my law partner for over 30 years, and my friend even longer. I was best man at his wedding to Ida. I watched you children grow up. I knew every aspect of his professional and personal life. Richard leaned forward, his voice firm but compassionate. Howard Wilson was not having an affair with his secretary. He did not secretly marry her. He did not leave a handwritten will giving her his house. These are fabrications designed to manipulate you into transferring valuable property out of your mother's name. You can't know that for certain, Thomas argued, though with less conviction than before. People keep secrets even from close friends. Not Howard, Richard countered. Not about something this significant. And certainly not from me, his attorney, who handled every aspect of his legal affairs. The conference room door opened, and Amanda entered. She was perfectly put together as always, in an expensive-looking black dress and heels, her hair and makeup flawless. She faltered slightly when she saw me, but quickly recovered her composure. "Thank you for the invitation, Richard," she said smoothly, taking a seat at the far end of the table. "Though I'm not sure what there is to discuss. The property transfer is complete and legal." "Legal is a matter of interpretation in this case," Richard replied coldly, "especially given the circumstances." "What circumstances would those be?" Amanda asked, her voice innocent, but her eyes wary. Richard opened the folder before him. "Let's start with your background, Ms. Phillips. Or should I say Ms. Watkins?" A flicker of surprise crossed Amanda's face before she controlled it. "I changed my name legally years ago. There's nothing suspicious about that." "Perhaps not on its own," Richard conceded. "But when combined with your history of inappropriate relationships with employers' sealed fraud records in Nevada and pattern of financial exploitation, it creates a concerning picture." He began laying out the evidence Stephen had gathered: her employment history, the suspicious timing of gifts and bequests from previous employers, witness statements from colleagues at Howard's firm who had noticed her unusual interest in his personal affairs. As Richard spoke, I watched my children's expressions change from confusion to dawning comprehension to horror. Even Thomas, the most stubbornly convinced of Amanda's story, looked increasingly troubled. "This is character assassination," Amanda protested, though her confident demeanor had begun to crack. "Howard and I had a special relationship. He loved me. He wanted me to have his home." "Then perhaps you can explain this," Richard said, sliding a document across the table. "Howard's medical records from 6 months before his death. He was experiencing mild cognitive decline, Amanda. His doctor noted it prescribed medication for it. Did you know about this condition when you began cultivating your special relationship?" Amanda's face paled slightly. Howard was perfectly sound of mind. He knew exactly what he was doing. "Did he?" Richard pressed. "Or was he vulnerable and confused, an easy target for someone with your particular skills?" Kevin leaned forward, his expression pained. "Amanda, you told me my dad gave you a key to the house years ago, that he showed you the loose floorboard in his office where he kept emergency cash." "That's right," Amanda said quickly. "Because he trusted me. Because we were close." "The thing is," Kevin continued, "Dad only showed me that hiding spot 2 months before he died. Said he'd just created it after reading some spy novel that gave him the idea. So how could he have shown it to you years ago?" Amanda's composure slipped further. I might have misremembered the timing. Or you might have found it on your own while snooping through his home." Linda suggested, her doctor's analytical mind now fully engaged in dissecting Amanda's story. "Just like you probably found old photo albums to learn family details, or accessed his personal files to learn about my parents' marital counseling 30 years ago." Thomas, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke up. "The handwritten will. It's a forgery, isn't it?" Amanda's eyes darted around the room, looking for an ally and finding none. "Thomas, you've seen the proof. You know your father wanted me to have the house." "What I know," Thomas said slowly, "is that my father was meticulous about legal matters. He would never have left something as important as his home to a handwritten note that wasn't witnessed or notarized. He was a lawyer, for God's sake." "And these supposed private accounts you shared with us," Linda added. "Where exactly did that money come from, Amanda? Because we've checked Dad's financial records and there's no evidence of any hidden accounts." Amanda's calm facade was crumbling rapidly. She stood abruptly, gathering her purse. "I don't have to listen to this. The house is mine now, legally. The paperwork is filed. You can't prove anything. Actually, Richard said, his voice quietly triumphant, we can. You see, I took the liberty of having the handwriting on that supposed will analysed by a forensic expert. It's a clever forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. And I have affidavits from Howard's doctor about his cognitive state, from his colleagues about your inappropriate behaviour. And now, he gestured to my children, potential testimony about how you bribed the Wilson children to participate in what amounts to elder abuse and fraud. This is ridiculous, Amanda snapped, but her voice had lost its confidence. You're all just jealous that Howard loved me in a way he never loved any of you. It was such an absurd statement that it momentarily stunned us into silence. Then unexpectedly I began to laugh. A small chuckle at first, then growing into full-throated laughter that released months of tension and pain. Oh, Amanda, I finally managed, wiping tears from my eyes. You didn't know Howard at all, if you believe that. He could be difficult, demanding, even emotionally distant at times. But he loved his family fiercely. Everything he built for us, including our home. Mum's right, Kevin said quietly. Dad wasn't perfect, but family meant everything to him. We made a terrible mistake, Linda admitted, looking directly at me. We let ourselves be manipulated because of our own complicated feelings about Dad. I'm so sorry, Mum. Thomas still looked troubled, but he nodded in agreement. I should have questioned this more thoroughly. The whole thing never quite added up. Amanda looked from face to face, seeing her control of the situation slipping away. Her expression hardened into something ugly and calculating. If you pursue this, I'll make sure everyone knows Howard's darkest secrets, the clients he overcharged, the ethical corners he cut. Enough, Richard interrupted sharply. Let me be absolutely clear, Ms. Phillips. If you attempt to defame Howard Wilson's professional reputation with fabricated allegations, I will personally see that you face not only civil, but criminal charges. Fraud, elder abuse, extortion. The list is quite extensive. Amanda's face flushed with anger. This isn't over, she hissed, then turned and stormed out of the conference room. In her wake, a heavy silence fell over the room. Then Thomas spoke, his voice uncharacteristically humble. Mum, I don't even know how to begin to apologize. I let money and a convincing story cloud my judgment. I failed you completely. We all did, Linda added, tears in her eyes. We should have come to you immediately when Amanda approached us. Instead, we let ourselves believe the worst about Dad, about your marriage. And we sold you out, Kevin said bluntly, for far less than 30 pieces of silver. I looked at my 3 children, seeing not just the adults they had become, but echoes of the children they had been. Thomas always trying to prove himself. Linda analytical and sometimes distant. Kevin impulsive but genuine. We have a lot to work through, I said honestly. But you're my children. Howard's children. We'll find our way back from this. Richard cleared his throat, bringing us back to practical matters. This is a good start, but we still have legal issues to resolve. The deed transfer is on record. We need to move quickly to reverse it before Amanda tries to sell the property or take out loans against it. What do we need to do? Thomas asked, shifting into business mode. First, I'll file for an emergency injunction preventing Amanda from selling or encumbering the property, Richard explained. Then we'll petition to invalidate the transfer based on fraudulent inducement and potential elder abuse of Ida. Will the money she gave us complicate things? Linda asked. The 50,000 she gave me is mostly gone. It might, Richard admitted. But if you're all willing to testify about how she misrepresented the source of those funds, claiming they were from Howard when they clearly weren't, it will strengthen our case significantly. I'll do whatever it takes, Kevin said immediately. Testify, return the money, anything. As will I, Linda agreed. Thomas nodded firmly. Count me in. I want to make this right. As we left Richard's office that afternoon, I felt the first real hope since returning from Europe to find my life upended. The road ahead would be difficult, legally, emotionally, and for our family relationships. But we had taken the first steps toward reclaiming not just my home, but our integrity as a family. "Come stay with us tonight, Mum," Thomas offered unexpectedly. "Diane and the girls would love to see you, and I think we have a lot more to talk about." I accepted his invitation, recognizing it as the olive branch it was. One step at a time, I thought. One step at a time. The legal battle to reclaim my home was neither quick nor easy. Amanda fought back with the desperation of someone who had come tantalizingly close to a $2 million windfall hiring her own attorney, who specialized in property disputes. Richard filed for an emergency injunction the day after our confrontation, preventing Amanda from selling the house or taking out loans against it while our case proceeded. The judge granted it based on the substantial evidence Richard presented about Amanda's fraudulent claims and manipulation of my children. Meanwhile, Stephen continued his investigation, uncovering more details about Amanda's past. Most significantly, he found a former colleague from Howard's law firm willing to testify that she had seen Amanda accessing Howard's personal files after hours on multiple occasions. She was always too interested in Mr. Wilson's personal affairs, the woman a long-time paralegal named Judith told us in Richard's office, asking about his family, his home, his finances. It went well beyond normal professional curiosity. Judith also revealed that in the months before Howard's death, when his mild cognitive decline had begun to manifest, Amanda had started staying late with him, offering to help with work he was struggling to complete. "Looking back, I think she was taking advantage of his confusion," Judith said sadly. "He was such a brilliant man, and it must have been frightening for him to feel his mind slipping. Amanda positioned herself as his supporter, his confidant. I should have said something at the time." "We all missed the signs," I assured her, though her words brought fresh pain. I had noticed Howard becoming forgetful, misplacing things, sometimes struggling to find the right words. But I had attributed it to normal aging, to the stress of his work. Had I missed an opportunity to protect him when he needed me most, Thomas proved unexpectedly valuable to our case. Once he accepted the truth about Amanda, his business acumen and attention to detail came to the fore. He meticulously documented every interaction with her, every promise made, every financial transaction. "She told us the money came from Dad's secret accounts," he explained as we prepared for court. "But the cashier's checks were drawn on her personal account. She claimed they were just a portion of what Dad had left her, but never provided any documentation of these supposed funds." Linda contributed her analytical skills, reviewing Howard's medical records with a doctor's eye. "Dad's cognitive decline was mild but significant," she reported. "The type that would have made him especially vulnerable to manipulation from someone he trusted professionally. He might not even have been aware it was happening." Kevin, true to his word, was ready to testify about Amanda's deceptions. "She played us against each other," he admitted during a preparation session with Richard. "Told me that Thomas and Linda had already agreed to the transfer, that I was the only one holding things up. I bet she told them the same thing about me." Through it all, I stayed with Margaret, unable to return to my home while Amanda remained in residence. It was agonizing to know she was sleeping in my bedroom, using my kitchen, sitting in Howard's study. But Margaret, steadfast as always, kept me grounded. "Focus on the end goal," she would remind me. "The house is just a building. It's the memories and your family that matter most." She was right, of course, though the house represented so much more than just a building to me. It was the physical manifestation of the life Howard and I had built together, the setting for our children's childhoods, the repository of 40 years of memories. 3 weeks after filing our case, we had our day in court. The courtroom was imposing, all dark wood and somber atmosphere. Amanda sat on one side with her attorney, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s, who specialized in property disputes. We sat on the other side, me, Richard, and my 3 children, presenting a united family front. Richard presented our case methodically, laying out the evidence of Amanda's deceptive practices, her history of similar behavior with other employers, and the medical evidence of Howard's cognitive decline. He called Judith to testify about Amanda's inappropriate access to Howard's personal information, and Howard's doctor to explain his condition in the months before his death. My children each testified about how Amanda had approached them after Howard's death, presenting the fabricated handwritten will and offering money she claimed was their inheritance from their father through her. Their admissions of accepting these funds were painful but honest, strengthening our case through their willingness to acknowledge their mistakes. When it was my turn to testify, I spoke about my 40-year marriage to Howard, our building of the home together, and the impossibility of him having a secret second relationship, much less a second marriage. Howard wasn't perfect, I acknowledged to the court. He was sometimes distant, often wrapped up in his work. But he was honest to his core with a deep sense of right and wrong. The idea that he would secretly marry his secretary while still married to me, or leave our home to her rather than his family, contradicts everything about the man I knew for 40 years. Amanda's attorney tried to paint a different picture, suggesting Howard had been unhappy in our marriage, that he had found in Amanda a more understanding companion. She presented the emails and photos Amanda had used to convince my children, trying to imply a deeper relationship than was evident from the actual content. Then Amanda took the stand. She was composed, articulate, her story well rehearsed. She spoke of a Howard I didn't recognize, secretly dissatisfied, lonely, seeking comfort in her arms. She claimed they had discussed divorce, but Howard had been concerned about my financial welfare and public embarrassment. He wanted to take care of both of us, she said smoothly. Me through our private arrangement, and Ida through the legal will. The house was meant to be mine, because we had planned to live there together once the time was right. Richard's cross-examination was masterful. Gently but relentlessly, he picked apart her story, exposing contradictions in her timeline, inconsistencies in her claims about when and how her relationship with Howard had supposedly developed. "Ms. Phillips," he said, toward the end of his questioning, "you claim to have been married to Howard Wilson in a private ceremony. Yet you can produce no marriage certificate, no witnesses, no evidence whatsoever of this supposed union. Can you explain why?" "We wanted absolute privacy," Amanda insisted. "It was a personal commitment between us, not a legal one." "I see," Richard said mildly. "And the handwritten will you showed the Wilson children, you claim Howard wrote that?" "Yes, of course." Richard nodded to the court clerk, who brought forward a document in a clear, protective sleeve. "Your Honor, this is the handwritten note Ms. Phillips presented as Howard Wilson's will. We've had it analyzed by a forensic handwriting expert." He turned back to Amanda. "Ms. Phillips, did you know that Howard Wilson broke his right wrist in a skiing accident in 1992, and afterward developed a distinctive way of forming certain letters? Our expert has identified significant inconsistencies between this document and confirmed samples of Howard's handwriting from the last 5 years of his life." Amanda's composure slipped for the first time. I don't know anything about that. He wrote it. I watched him." "Did you?" Richard asked quietly. "Or did you forge it yourself, Ms. Phillips, just as you forged a relationship that never existed, in order to manipulate his grieving family and steal their home?" Amanda's attorney objected, but the damage was done. The careful facade Amanda had constructed began to crumble under Richard's precise questioning. By the time she left the witness stand, her credibility was in tatters. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, took only 2 days to render her decision. We gathered back in the courtroom, the tension palpable as she delivered her ruling. "Having reviewed all evidence presented in this case," the judge began, "I find compelling reason to invalidate the property transfer of the Wilson family home to Amanda Phillips. The evidence strongly suggests this transfer was obtained through fraudulent means, exploiting both Howard Wilson's declining cognitive state before his death and subsequently manipulating his children through false claims and financial inducements." Relief flooded through me, so powerful I nearly collapsed in my seat. Margaret, who had come to support me, squeezed my hand tightly. "Furthermore," the judge continued, her voice hardening, "I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal charges against Ms. Phillips for fraud, elder abuse, and document forgery." Amanda sat rigid in her seat, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. Her attorney leaned over, whispering urgently in her ear. Ms. Phillips is ordered to vacate the property within 72 hours, the judge concluded. The deed shall be restored to Ida Wilson as the rightful owner. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to break the spell of the past months. It was over. I had won. My home would be mine again. As we left the courtroom, Amanda rushed past us, avoiding eye contact, her attorney hurrying behind her. I felt no triumph in her defeat, only relief that justice had prevailed, and a deep sadness for what my family had endured. "Mom," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know if you can ever forgive us, but I already have." I interrupted, embracing my eldest son. "We all made mistakes. Howard's death left wounds that haven't healed properly. But we're family. We'll find our way forward together." Linda joined our embrace, tears streaming down her usually composed face. "We'll make this right, Mom, whatever it takes." Kevin completed our circle, his artistic sensitivity evident in the depths of emotion on his face. "Family first," he said simply. "Dad would want that." Richard watched our reconciliation with satisfaction. "Howard would be proud," he said quietly. "Not of what happened, but of how you're all finding your way back to each other." 3 days later, Richard, Margaret, and I stood on the sidewalk outside my home, waiting for the sheriff's deputy, who would officially oversee Amanda's departure. Thomas, Linda, and Kevin had wanted to be there, but I had asked them to give me this moment alone. This was between Amanda and me. The front door opened, and Amanda emerged with 2 large suitcases. She looked smaller, somehow less imposing. Her designer clothes replaced with simple jeans and a sweater. Behind her, a moving company was loading boxes into a truck. Our eyes met across the front lawn. I expected to see hatred, defiance, but instead saw something that surprised me: defeat, and perhaps a flicker of shame. Without a word, she wheeled her suitcases to a waiting taxi, climbed in, and was gone from my life as suddenly as she had entered it. The deputy checked the house to ensure it was being properly vacated, then handed me a new set of keys. "All yours again, ma'am," he said with a kind smile. "Congratulations." I stood at the threshold of my home, keys in hand, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought me back to this moment. Richard and Margaret waited patiently behind me, understanding the significance of this homecoming. Taking a deep breath, I inserted the key, turned the lock, and opened the door to reclaim the life that had almost been stolen from me. 6 months after reclaiming my home, I hosted a family dinner. The dining room table, where Howard had presided for so many years, was set with our best china candles, lit flowers from our garden arranged in the center. It felt like a new beginning, a healing ceremony for wounds still tender, but finally closing. Thomas arrived first with Diane and their teenage daughters, carrying a bottle of Howard's favorite scotch. "For a toast," he explained, setting it carefully on the sideboard. In the months since the court case, Thomas had been working hard to rebuild our relationship, stopping by regularly to help with house maintenance, calling just to check in, showing through actions rather than words his remorse and renewed commitment to family. Linda came with her husband and son, bringing a homemade apple pie, Howard's favorite dessert. She had been making efforts in her own way, sharing more of her life, inviting me to her son's school events, creating space in her busy schedule for family time. Kevin was last to arrive, typically running late, but he brought his new girlfriend, a music teacher named Rachel, who looked at him with obvious affection. Kevin had perhaps changed the most, taking steps towards stability without abandoning his creative passions. He had a steady job teaching guitar now alongside his band performances, and was talking about returning to school for a music education degree. As we gathered around the table, I felt Howard's absence acutely, but also sensed his presence in the family he had helped create. The ghost of Amanda Phillips and her betrayal seemed distant now, a painful chapter closed. "Before we eat," I said, raising my glass, "I want to thank all of you for being here, for working through one of the most difficult periods our family has ever faced. I know your father would be proud of how we've come together." "To Dad," Thomas said, raising his glass in turn. "And to Mum, who taught us what real strength looks like." After dinner, as the family moved to the living room for coffee and pie, Margaret arrived. She had given us space for our family dinner, but joined us now for dessert as honorary family. The children welcomed her warmly, understanding how crucial her support had been during my darkest days. "I have an announcement," I said once everyone was settled with coffee and pie. "I've decided to make some changes." All eyes turned to me, curious. "First, I've started a support group for older adults who've experienced financial exploitation or elder abuse. Richard has been helping me organize it, and we've already got 10 members. "That's wonderful, Mum," Linda said warmly, "using your experience to help others." "Second," I continued, "I've updated my will and established a living trust." I looked meaningfully at each of my children. "The house will still come to you three eventually, but with some important provisions to prevent anything like this from happening again." Thomas nodded solemnly. "Smart move. We've all learnt the hard way how vulnerable these arrangements can be." "And third," I said, taking a deep breath, "I've decided to take another trip. Not as long as the Europe journey, but important. I'm going to visit Howard's grave in Maine near his childhood home. I haven't been since the funeral, and I think it's time." Kevin reached over and squeezed my hand. "Would you like company, Mum? Any of us would be happy to go with you." "Thank you, Kevin, but this is something I need to do alone. Howard and I have some unfinished conversations." Later, after everyone had gone, Margaret helped me clear the last of the dishes. "That went well," she observed. "They're really trying." "They are," I agreed. "We all are." "And what about Amanda?" Margaret asked. "Any word on the criminal charges?" Richard had kept me updated on the legal aftermath. "She took a plea deal, probation restitution and community service. She's moved to California, apparently. Starting over, I suppose." "Do you ever wonder what Howard would think about all this?" Margaret asked, drying a wineglass carefully. I considered the question. "I think he'd be horrified that his secretary manipulated our children, angry that his cognitive decline was exploited. But mostly I think he'd be relieved that we found our way back to being a family. And what about you, Ida? How are you really doing?" I looked around my kitchen, the heart of the home Howard and I had built together. The pain of betrayal had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something more manageable, a scar rather than an open wound. "I'm okay," I said honestly. "Some days are harder than others. I still get angry thinking about how easily Amanda almost took everything, how my own children believed her over me. But then I remember that we're all flawed, all vulnerable in different ways." Margaret nodded understanding as always. "And the support group, is that helping?" "More than I expected," I admitted. Hearing other people's stories, realizing I'm not alone in experiencing this kind of betrayal, it puts things in perspective. And being able to help others navigate the legal and emotional maze I went through, it gives purpose to the pain. The following weekend, I drove to the small coastal cemetery in Maine where Howard was buried. It was a beautiful autumn day, the maple trees ablaze with color, the air crisp and clean. Howard had loved this time of year. I sat beside his grave, placing a small bouquet of flowers against the headstone. "Well, Howard," I said aloud, feeling only slightly self-conscious about talking to a granite marker. "It's been quite a year." I told him everything about Amanda's scheme, our children's misguided actions, the court battle, and most importantly, the healing that had followed. It felt good to say it all aloud, to imagine Howard listening with his practical lawyer's mind and occasional dry humor. "I'm not angry anymore," I concluded. "Not at the children, anyway. They made mistakes, but they've worked hard to make amends. Not even at Amanda, really. She's a damaged person who saw an opportunity and took it. I'm just grateful we found our way back to the truth." A gentle breeze rustled the maple leaves above me, sending a shower of red and gold fluttering down around the grave. I could almost hear Howard's voice. "Always the compassionate one, Ida. It's why I loved you." On the drive back to Boston, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The house would always be special to me, filled with memories of the life Howard and I had built together. but I understood now that its true value lay not in the structure itself, but in what it represented: family commitment, perseverance. Back home, I called each of my children to let them know I had returned safely from Maine. Their concern, their eagerness to hear how the trip had gone, their genuine interest in my emotional well-being, all confirmed that we were on the right path. That night, I sat in Howard's study, surrounded by his books, his collected mementos, the artifacts of a life well lived. I thought about how close I had come to losing this sanctuary, this repository of our shared history. Con kai kuthe lady ngonya koban, I murmured, but they cannot take away your dignity or your truth. Sometimes the greatest loss opens the way to the most precious things: truth, courage, and the capacity for forgiveness. Has your family ever faced a crisis that ultimately brought you closer together? Or have you had to stand up against people you loved for what was right? Share your stories in the comments below. And if this journey of betrayal and reconciliation has touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear that. Even the deepest family wounds can heal with time and effort. Thank you for walking this path with me today. And remember that in the end, it's not the house that makes a home, but the love and truth we cultivate within its walls.